Hi there, you're listening to the Practical Stoic podcast with your host, me, Simon Drew. If you'd like to listen to over 200 episodes that were recorded before 2020, then you can head to my Patreon site. It's patreon.com/Simon J.E. Drew. We'd love to have you there, and any support is greatly appreciated. We'd love to also have you on our Facebook community, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But for now, enjoy the show. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic podcast. Now, continuing in this week's festivities, having multiple guests on at once, I have got two amazing guests on today. And guys, listen, strap in because it gets deep. It gets really heavy really quickly, and I love that. So we have two awesome guests. We have Kai Whiting. Many of you will have heard him on the show before. If you haven't, go back and check out those episodes because he's such an awesome guy. A researcher and lecturer in sustainability and Stoicism and everything in between. So he's so deep in so many subjects and I can't keep up with him, but he's become quite a good friend, and man, I love having him on the show all these times. So go back and check out those episodes, and there's also one on my Patreon site as well. But the guest who he recommended to come on the show with him today, I'm so glad that he did, is Will Johncock, a fellow Australian. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Will's work because he's a sociologist, so he brings a completely different discipline into the realm of Stoicism and gives us that perspective. But Will Johncock, he is the author of Stoic Philosophy and Social Theory. His book is a comparative study of ancient Stoic philosophy and modern social theory, the primary topic concerning how, as individuals, we are also socially and communally constituted and directed. His previous book, Naturally Late, Synchronization in Socially Constructed Times, explores philosophical and sociological distinctions between natural timings and human-constructed timings. You can find him on Twitter at Will Johncock. So I'm going to put all of the links in the show notes to where you can find Will's work and Kai's work as well. And get ready because I love this interview and I'm so excited to have Will back on many more times as I am for Kai. So without any further ado, I present to you my guests today, Kai Whiting and Will Johncock. Okay, so we are here with two excellent guests today. So we have Kai Whiting and we'll also have Will Johncock. Now, it seems like Australians are taking over this podcast, but what I wanted to do from the start of this episode is Kai, you actually first introduced me to Will last week. So this is a pretty, well, I don't know when we'll release this episode, probably next week, so 2 weeks ago. But you said, we've got to have a conversation with Will. He's just coming out with this awesome book, and you always give really kind introductions. And so I thought, Kai, seeing as you've been on the show before, and I don't necessarily need to introduce you because everybody knows you and they love what you do and how you speak. Why don't you tell the audience and myself again, why did you introduce me to Will? And why did you want to have this conversation? And then Will, I'll let you come in as well.
Okay.
So Will, I would say, is a colleague of mine, even though he's based in Australia. So the cosmopolitan here as an academic at the University of New South Wales. And I came across his work via, I'd heard of him before, but it was really via a blog post. And I just identified a nuance. And I was like, I really, really, really like this blog post. However, there's a slight nuance that I have to correct. I hope you don't mind. And it was like, okay, what the nuance was, he said something like the universe was inanimate. And I was like, not from a Stoic perspective. So that's kind of what an academic does. Like, I really enjoyed it, however. And he was really gracious in his reply. It was like, Kai, we need to have a chat, which is kind of what Simon does to me normally, Will. Like, Kai, we need to have a chat. So let's have a chat. And we just had this really nice chat for 2.5 hours. And I've never done that. I've not had a 2.5 hour chat with anybody, I don't think, that I've never met before, especially on Skype. I think even if you have your first date, it doesn't last 2.5 hours, right? So I was like, wow, we have so much in common because it just didn't feel like work, but it was work. So Will really intrigued me because he was doing something, he was pushing the boat out in a different way. So I think I pushed the Stoic boat out towards like the environmental and moored it in that kind of arena for me. And his background is sort of sociology. I'll let you introduce yourself a bit more later, I will. And I was like, okay, wow, what does that mean? So he was really pushing the boat out on like social structures and social concerns, which I do have some overlap. So there is some overlap between like Will's work and my own, because I talk about sustainability, which has a social aspect, but I didn't really push it out to the level that he was pushing it out to. So I was like, this guy has some, has some knowledge that I need, or information he needs to share, so I can convert that into knowledge, because they're not the same. And I just was really intrigued. And he's like, oh, I've got this new book out. And I was like, oh, great. And so I said, do you mind if I just like read something? So actually, I cited you in this particular chapter. Do you want to read that one? So it's always nice as academic to see how your work is being used and how it's like contributing to the Stoic academic field, rather than the Stoic movement, or the Stoic social movement, which people tend to call the modern Stoic movement. I like to call it more like the contemporary Stoic movement. And I just really enjoyed that he was talking about a very orthodox version of Stoicism, the kind of things that you were talking about, Simon. You said, like, when you said, and I was really blown away by it, like you have this understanding that I'm not in control of everything, and the nature becomes very fundamental to my walk or my journey in Stoicism. And the way that you put it was so much better than I've just said it. It was like, yes, even in the contemporary Stoic movement, we're understanding that there's a need to acknowledge the essence of nature, or some kind of God. It's not just an atheistic expression necessarily, that it really goes well with Stoic clearly. So I'll let Will take it from there, maybe.
Yeah, jump in, Will.
So I became interested in Kai's work, I suppose, firstly through his attempts to intersect environmentalism or questions around sustainability, more specifically with Stoic questions. And part of that discussion, which did appeal to me, was the question around pantheism. So for the viewers who might not be too familiar with pantheistic definitions, let's say, of the world, it concerns, for the Stoics, where God is omnipresent in the world, and more specifically, God's rationality. And so this is one of the ways in which the Stoics will describe nature, not only our nature, but universal nature. And that becomes very important when we consider why the Stoics are so emphatic about our social or communal orientations, because we all share in this rationality. So anyway, so to get back to what Kai was saying, I found something in his work quite appealing, in that he was defending the orthodox reading of Stoicism, which wants to maintain that we live in a pantheistic world. And for modern Stoicism, there's the question about how you integrate something like pantheism within climate science, which is evidence-based. It's an empirical field. And when we think of pantheism, or when we think of God, and when we think of theological themes, we think of faith, and we think of inquiries which aren't necessarily bound up in what climate science might be involved in. But nevertheless, I think, and I think Kai does too, that it's important, if we're going to engage Stoicism on these kinds of questions, that we don't relinquish some of its core elements, and pantheism for me is one of those. And it's part of the tension in engaging ancient ideas. Is how do you manipulate, how do you maneuver with the terms without relinquishing them entirely?
Yeah, and I think that not only that, but it has to be about getting to as much truth as we can possibly lay our hands on, right? It's like I don't think that it should ever be about, like, okay, there's room for preserving the ancient ideas. You might say that's for the classics, the classics professors. That's for historians, to keep those ideas there. Then there's room to push the boundaries and try and see what, like, okay, where does science play a role? Where does sociology play a role? How do we see Stoicism through those lenses? But then there has to be that person in the middle who says, okay, well, what's the most amount of truth that we can possibly get here, and how do we get that out to people, right? And that's why I'm so interested in this idea of pantheism and trying to figure out, what did the Stoics say about God? What wasn't? We have such a distorted view in our Western culture, especially, right, of what God is, because we immediately think Christianity, we think prosperity gospel, we think that God, right? And as soon as that pops into your head, you see it when you're talking to people. As soon as you say God, their eyes light up and they're like, well, this couldn't possibly be anything. You're like, slow down. Like, that's not what the Stoics saw as a God, right? So can we actually, let's jump straight into the conversation there, Will. Like what is your perspective of what the Stoic God is, and also
Okay.
what do you think that translates to today with modern science and stuff like that?
Okay. I would probably there have to begin with how I became interested in Stoicism. And I didn't have a moment where Stoicism for me was all of a sudden the reason I was interested in philosophy. I didn't have that yes, Stoicism kind of moment. It more kind of encroached on me because I was working with philosophy anyway. And then I was also within a peer group who were interested in intellectual inquiry in many regards. And so it was inevitable that I would brush up against Stoicism as well, given its increased popularity in the last 10 years. And I remember when I first became interested in Stoicism, I became very interested in the physics that they have. And for me, the Stoic God and Stoic physics present a nice symmetry in terms of how we understand ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. Now, there are two aspects of the Stoic physics which are important here. One is that they present a monistic sense of the universe. What that means is a singular, in this case, substance, or rationality-infused substance, which permeates everything to various degrees. And they also describe this physical condition for the world as being a collegial condition. So we all share in it, and that underpins why we're in this singular community. So when we think about God, or when I think about the God in the Stoic sense, I think about how it truly connects me with everything else that's going on. And from Seneca to Marcus Aurelius, we get this really emphatic directive that you are a part of an interconnected whole. Everything you do is as a limb of an interconnected whole. And in that regard, God becomes less of a transcendent figure who oversees everything to being the condition of why I'm involved in everything in the first place, why I became what I became. Now, that just saying it that way in a current context sounds dangerous if you're not necessarily theologically inclined, because I'm saying that God is responsible for my belonging in the world, the way I do things, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it's exactly what you said. We have to understand God in a slightly different way from what religion now is understood as being, which is a divine principle outside the created universe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's something about God which is much more internal to the world for the Stoics.
And Kai, you might want to come in here as well, but I'd like to add, like, does it almost seem unnecessary to even use the term God? So, for example, in Eastern philosophy, there is the tradition of saying, well, we don't necessarily know what it is, but whatever it is, it just makes all of this work, and it's you and it's me, and it's not just my fingers, it's the space between my fingers, because without that space, these fingers don't exist. So if you think about the space as well as the physical, right, then everything becomes part of everything, right? And so there's almost, like Seneca, he would say in one sentence, God, the Logos, and gods, and you'd be like, whoa, Seneca, what are you saying? Like, who is it that you're talking about, right? And I think that that's almost because he didn't feel it was necessary to label it as one specific thing, but just to say, whatever it is, I know that it's making all of this work, and there's no way that I can possibly understand it. So all I can do is unite with it, right? And try to listen to it, or to try and connect with it on some level, right? Like, what do you guys think of, like, do you think it's necessary to say God, or should we just say whatever it is that makes all of this work?
Problem is, if I say logos, right, the Christians have a view of the logos, and that is like Jesus, because the logos is the word is God,
Yeah.
and that they have like took that. So even if I use the word logos, when I do use the word logos, Christians eyes light up and go, "You mean like what John said?" I'm like, "No, I don't mean what John said necessarily, because logos isn't just the word, and the word isn't necessarily Jesus." So using that word, I don't actually avoid the problem. It actually becomes more religious because of the way that Christians adopted that term and how it's very, very important. Even if you don't know Greek as a Christian, even particularly evangelical, you're going to know logos. So that they have even cruise ships, Christian cruise ships called the logos, right? So it is still bonded to the Christian faith. And if I use the word universe, then I get into the problem that Will tripped over when I was like looking at his work, saying is inanimate, because the way that we see the word universe, we use it in a sort of literal physical sense in physics. So if I use the word universe, you have a different connotation to what I actually mean if I mean God.
I think it's somebody who makes dream catchers, for example.
Yeah, like the universe. You could also get into the secret, which I absolutely disdain.
Yeah.
We don't need to mention it anymore because it's that evil. Because we'll just sit there and it'll come to us. No, and then
Damn it, Oprah's coming on the show next week. No, just kidding.
Exactly. And then you've got the logos issue. So I think like I've written about this, that we need to claim terms. Like your name's Simon. I could call you Mr. Drew, right? But you're also called Simon, and I'm sure you've got a nickname somewhere. So
I now prefer Mr.
Drew,
but go on.
Okay, Mr. Drew. So we could call you by different names, but we could just come to an agreement about, when I say God in this context, this is what I mean. And I feel like, why should I relinquish a particular word because like certain Stoics, either in the contemporary movement or even academics, feel uncomfortable? For me, especially if you're an academic and you feel uncomfortable with it, you have to do your due diligence. You can't just say, and I don't need to mention names, and we know who those people are. I don't like the word God, and that's it. Okay, do your due diligence and really carefully look at that terminology and ask yourself, like, even Epictetus is probably the most theologically inclined Roman Stoic. When he says God, what does he mean? And if you want to go into like Chrysippus, who does real, proofing about why there is a God, what does he mean? And then say, okay, when I use the word God, am I using it in a Catholic sort of with Catholic connotation? Oh, perhaps I should stop doing that, because as an academic, you should feel comfortable with terms if they're well defined. And I would say the Stoic God is well defined in those contexts. But I'll pass it on to Will.
Yeah, cool.
You mean in terms of the Stoic God being defined in various terms, Kai?
I think, yeah, but we do have the Stoic God in various terms. Like Chrysippus has a certain way of speaking about God. Epictetus certainly has. Marcus has. But in no way, shape, or form, I would say any of that is linked to particularly the Christian or Judaic, as opposed to say the Islamic, which is slightly more complex. But I don't see why, if you've done your due diligence and you've really looked at the word God and how it's used, you can come to the conclusion that the Christian is kind of, even if you say it's not the Christian God, that's not the issue. We all say that it's not the Christian God, but then we still have debates as if it were. Even as academics, like I still find myself debating. I know I'm not talking about Jesus or the Christian connotation of Jesus. However, the kind of language and the framing is still, to me, very Christian. Even if they have this disclaimer, I'm not talking about the Christian God. And then we still have this kind of debate as if we were talking about the Christian God. So I just wondered what you thought about, as an academic, having the ability to step back and really look at terms. I mean, you're a sociologist. I know it's part of your training.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand from the modern Stoic point of view and the movement behind that, I can understand the motivation to want to replace the word God. I get the sense that Stoicism's application to questions such as environmental science can seem to be more rigorous if we pull that out of it and if we replace that term with another term. And you're right, as a sociologist, I am interested in questions of normative power that occurs discursively, the way that words and phrases and the way that we describe things can shape our understanding of the things. It's not just a label. So I can understand the motivation. And you're right also that within the Stoic academic community, when people use a term like God, the scholars and commentators will understand what that means. The question there becomes, when you go into the public arena, does the meaning get translated adequately? And I think a lot of modern Stoics think that it doesn't. And as a result, there's a pragmatic kind of direction taken where we will replace God with science or the facts, as Lawrence Becker says, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And, you know, we're going in so many different directions here, and I'm so glad that we started with God, but I think we should have ended with it because there's so much that I want to get to before that. But I think, honestly, from my perspective, I really don't think that you can, put science in place of whatever the Stoics talk about in terms of God. And the reason I think that is because science has a connotation, and it comes back to connotations. It's like, what's the public going to perceive? But there's a connotation that science is something that we can understand. We can always have the answers if we do the right thing. You know, that's what the public kind of sees science as. It's like our ability as humans to always know what's right. But there's a real power in relinquishing that control of your own rationality and relinquishing that tight grip that you have on, I can always know what is true, right? Like there's such a tight I really think that it's essential to the idea of aligning with nature, because there is an element of relinquishing your control in this idea of alignment with nature. It's like, I don't know everything. I don't know why things are happening to me like the way they are, but I relinquish my control and I control what I can because it's fate. It's whatever will happen. I don't understand it. Do you know what I mean at all?
In terms of control, I guess you have that real dichotomy, don't you, in the Stoics, where a large part of it and a large part of its public appeal is about what you can control. And that's a very important part of Epictetus's work, for instance, but it's present throughout. There is also a sense, and I think this is what you might be getting at, and it speaks to the social question as well of Stoicism, which is that my nature is not just my own nature. So in one regard, my nature is to control these particular aspects. I mean, the term control is contentious anyway within Stoicism, but let's just use it for its sake now. Most definitely the Stoics are interested in being rational, only concerning ourselves with things that we can, let's say, control. But in another regard, that nature that we have, that rational nature, is not just our own. That rational nature is something that's, we are a fragment of it, in fact, and it's quite universal. And so in that regard, we have to look at our nature both as entirely internal to us, but also as something that's beyond us, which I think is a very interesting aspect of Stoicism.
And this is something that you talk about in your book, right? This kind of interesting comparison between following, say, you know, your individual nature, but also the nature of the society, the group that you're within, right? So this has been a good segue. Your book, Stoic Philosophy and Social Theory. You know, I want you to just tell us everything that you're fascinated by around Stoicism as it relates to sociology, right? Because this is a new perspective. And what's the book all about? You know, it's got a scary title for those who might not be so, you know, like...
I know, it's a very dry title, isn't it?
But I know it's going to be awesome, right? So I'm not saying people shouldn't read it. I'm just saying, like, explain to us, what's it all about? What are you looking at here?
Okay. Well, I'm interested in integrating Stoic philosophy and social theory. And as we've indicated earlier in the discussion, I'm aware that Stoicism's most, let's say, publicly popular themes often concern how to develop your individual rational self. And that's part of Stoicism's pragmatic value. Intertwined with that is a very important aspect of Stoicism, which is that each self is an expression of, let's say, a communal rationality. So while you're working on your own rational self, you're working on something about yourself which is not just exclusive to you. Now, this becomes interesting when we compare it to sociological and social theory, and your listeners might not be too familiar with those fields. Basically, they're interested in studying social structures. So they explore quite often the contingent ways that we are socialized. So think about how in one particular environment, you might act and think and feel, and it's completely normal to do so, and everyone around you does so. in another culture, in another society, those ways of acting and thinking and feeling are going to be different. There are going to be different patterns, different social trends, different social norms. And sociology and social theory will look at these and distinguish why people behave differently in different social environments, different cultures as well. Now, this presents a nice comparison with Stoicism, because Stoic philosophy says we should be indifferent often, quite often, to what is socially conventional. They say things like reputation, gossip about ourselves, our economic class, etc. These aspects are external to our internal rational control in Stoicism. So on one hand, you have social theory and sociology not only identifying, but often endorsing the way that we're inherently socialized, because that's how we form groups and communities and things like that. Whereas in another regard, Stoicism counters this kind of the ways that we are socially contingently shaped by our surroundings. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that the Stoics discount the belief that we are internally socially constituted. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius will describe how we're part of this universal fellowship and community. Epictetus talks about our social duties. You have Hierocles in Elements of Ethics talking about our communal nature, often with people we've never met. And Cicero in his On Duties will talk about this as well for the earlier Stoics. So the communal nature for the Stoics is very important. And as I've already indicated in our discussion, the condition for this communal nature is the fact that our internal rationality is a fragment of a universal rationality. And this common constitution for many Stoics is what heralds a worldly singular community. And again, that's what you can see in some of the cosmopolitan positions, such as Hierocles. So despite the differences between Stoicism and social and sociological theory, the fact that both fields conceive of our internality as a trace of something communal means that I open up a discussion between the two.
Yeah, I like that. So kind of trying to tease out what the Stoics would say about how much you say should be involved in, say, your culture versus, you know, like the global community. What do you think? What do you think is the Stoic perspective, or what would you say your perspective is on, say, for example, how much we should be involved in trying to steer our culture, for example, in the direction of virtue? Because I know that the Stoics are very individualistic, right? Like, hey, you focus on yourself, and as a result, maybe you affect your family, your community, your country. But to what extent should we try to steer culture in the right way?
Okay, great question. In my regards, the Stoics are very individualistic. They encourage personal development in a way. They're saying you've got these things that you can control, you focus on those, be indifferent to what happens outside those. In another regard, we see this a lot in Seneca actually, he'll say that your individual well-being is actually a product of collective well-being. And it's almost like we're in Stoic, or it is a lot like in Stoicism, where we see that in order to be happy, and happiness for the Stoics is a different term from how we understand it today with eudaimonia, but nevertheless, they say, in order to live a happy life, you shouldn't target happiness. You should rather just be virtuous. And from that, happiness will manifest. Happiness is the process, eudaimonia, the well-being. Now, it's a similar kind of thing, particularly in Seneca, with our individual well-being. Seneca is emphatic that our individual well-being will not manifest if we target it. What it will manifest from is cohesive communal relations and recognizing that we serve the communal, which in turn is serving ourselves. And I think that's part of the practical aspect of, and I know this is a practical podcast, and part of the practical aspect of what I indicated my book addresses earlier, in appreciating that what is internal to you is a trace of something entirely common to everyone else. So this idea of that your internal reasoning, your internal rationality is a trace of something common to everyone else, sorry. So if you think about, say, the COVID-19 demand to self-isolate. It's quite contextual. If you consider your internal reasoning to be a trace of something that is common or collective or communal, then the demand to self-isolate is a demand to fulfill your social duties. If everyone firstly defines themselves, as I believe much of Stoicism does, as a fragment of a communal entity, then your default or your priority is to serve collective ends, not individual ends. But then it's through those collective ends that your individual ends also manifest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that. So it's kind of like I never really fully grasped this from Seneca. You're saying that he's kind of saying that we do have a responsibility. It's not necessarily a responsibility. It's just a natural. That's who we are. We will always be acting in our rationality is unequivocally linked to the social structure that we live in. Right. That's essentially what. Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's, but what do the Stoics say about, and Kai, you can probably jump in here, right? Because I've been thinking about this. If we took you, Kai Whiting, and, somebody gave birth to you again, but you're in a different country. Horrifying scene, but anyway. So, so now you're born in India, right? Okay. You're not going to be who you are right now. Right. Yeah. You're going to be somebody completely different, right?
Well, not completely, because I still, from a Stoic position, I still have because there's two things that are nature given. There's my humanity. So
yeah, universal nature, right?
So yeah, that is given by God or Logos, or the universe, or the discussion we had. And then I have characteristics that are given by the Logos, God/universe. So I still have some traits that are given to me. So I can still, and then it's not like that are unique to me necessarily. So the Stoics never say, like Cicero doesn't say, oh, only Kai has this, or Epictetus, only Kai has this. Now they'll say, like, for example, Kai is gregarious, or Kai is particularly inclined towards the virtue of justice, right? So he has this sort of characteristic that is not necessarily that is not universal to everyone, but it's not unique to him. This is like this world of fragments. So there's the individual who has humanity, which is universal, and then his or her characteristics, which are not universal to everyone, but are universal across humanity. If I'm pro-social and I'm what they would call neurotypical, as in I fall within the range of a normal human being with functions, and I could even if I was not neurotypical, but could take medicine, I would basically adjust to the bell-shaped curve. So from a Stoic perspective, there's two of those roles. So my circumstances and my choices that would be different if I was born in India, right? So that's the interesting thing about that fragment of the soul from the Logos. That Will puts this very nicely with the daimon, and he talks about being purist. That you have that you have some part of you that's individual, but there's some part that's part of the whole. So that's that tension that we find, and then where we have to be virtuous through those four roles that we're given. So yes, Kai born in India, it's very likely, for example, that I would have a different idea of religion, depending on which community I was born in. I could be Christian, I could be Hindu, I could be Muslim. Unlikely to be atheistic if I'm born in India. I have a very sort of different view on like socio-economic systems, but that depends. Am I wealthy? Am I poor? Am I rural? So even if it really would depend on India. But yes, there would be certain things in my culture that would change who I am. Definitely. I probably wouldn't like things like tea, English style tea, as much as a more of a Indian style tea. I might have a lot more milk and a lot more sugar in my tea, right? And then I might really like Bollywood and not really like Hollywood as much, because I've grown up. My parents, I imagine, took me, and I was there in the cinema for 3 hours at a time. I might be very averse to public transport because it doesn't work so well. So I might have a view that everyone should have a car. I might have some different health conditions because I live in a more polluted area. So yeah, there are certain things from a Stoic perspective. I'm just talking from a Stoic perspective, not really a sociological one. Yes, there are elements of Kai that are different, but there are elements of Kai that are the same. Right?
Well, okay, you've set me up for the question, because this is exactly what I want to talk about, right? So we've established that if you're born in a different country, you take on completely different parts of yourself that are simply a result of the culture. And I'm sure that Will, you can talk all about that as well. But my question is simply this. So Seneca said that we have two things that are always ours and nobody can take them from us. That is our universal nature, and that is our ability to act virtuously, right? So my question is, if you take you out of your country and you're born in another country and you take on all these different traits, right? How much of your culture is actually you? That's my question. Because like if I'm born in a different place, but then I grow up completely differently and I'm a completely different person, is that me, right? Or is the me what the Stoics may have talked about? Hey, when we talk about the pantheistic sort of view, it's like, is the you the soul, right? That doesn't change no matter where you're born, but that's your traits, right? The things that you're naturally inclined towards. But then the culture is something, I almost feel like the Stoics' perspective on this, and you guys can probably correct me on this, is we have nature, which we accept, and then we have culture, which we are cautious towards, right? So that you've got to have that balance there, right? What do you think? Like, how much of your culture is actually you, and is something that you should? I don't know. It's a rough question. It might not even have an answer.
Well, you're a sociologist. I think I'll just jump in very quickly, and then do you remember what we said about the difference between talent and inclination? We were talking about your music skills. So you would still, somewhat you could say you still have the inclination to play music if you were born in India, but the type of music you would play would be different. Or if you were born in such an impoverished household and you were never able to play an instrument, you might still be inclined to listen to music or really appreciate music, because you have that natural inclination from a Stoic perspective. Yeah. But you never ever fulfilled it. So that would be where I draw the lines of nature. I have the characteristics that I'm inclined towards. Like I have an inclination towards justice. I might, if I was wealthy, become a judge. If I was poor, I might become a more reasonable thief. I don't know, like depending on my circumstances, although I would be somewhat contradicts my call to be pro-social, perhaps, depending on why I'm thieving in the first place. So I might be like the honor among thieves, right? So like I can still have that inclination, and just how it made itself manifest is different. But I'll let Will, because this is more your expertise, answer that more fully.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I would say that the part of you for the Stoics, which is always you, is not going to comprise much of your social surroundings. In fact, I think across many of the ancient thinkers in that regard, you'd get this real aversion to letting that define who you are. It would more be a matter of how you were responding to each of the different contexts in which you were presented. Yeah. And you get those discussions in Seneca about when he journeys into more peaceful or more busy or frantic environments, and the discussion is about how tranquil he will remain in the relative, quiet of the countryside versus in the more urban environment. And so, in that regard, I suppose the Stoics and sociology are doing quite different things. In that, sociology is very interested in how we are shaped, and indeed, they'll talk about our social nature as being part of this collective consciousness in a way. Now, there's something dispersed about consciousness for the Stoics too. It's a very different sense of dispersion. And it's more a sense of you're a fragment of this universal reason. And then you as Kai has indicated, you then do with it what you will in different ways to each other. And if those ways are affected by your surroundings, and for the Stoics, I say that would be distancing yourself from who you essentially are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there is kind of that caution towards your culture, right? Like, not that you should be trying to not play an important role in the progression of society, not that you shouldn't say try to improve things, but it's like make the best of it, but make sure that you don't. I always say it's like this, and you might agree or disagree. It's like they say, be in the crowd, but not of the crowd, right? Like you should still be amongst the people, but you shouldn't necessarily let all of that wash off on you.
Right. Yeah, I guess for the Stoics definitely don't discount localized city structures, let's say. In one regard, you get descriptions of the city, such as in Cleant and Marcus Aurelius too, where they'll describe the whole universe as a city. And I think Marcus Aurelius calls it the city of Zeus. And you get this sense of a citizenship in a global social structure or a universal social structure. But then in another regard, the Stoics do discuss how we participate in very localized geographies. And they don't discount the idea that that's important and that we should help our neighbor. And think about Hierocles' circles. I believe some of your audience will be familiar with that. The idea that you have these really familial relations with people around you, with your family, with people in your town, etc. And those are important. And you can use the more familiar relations as a guide to how you should treat people who are further away. And so the Stoics just don't disperse everything into one universal community and say, you're just in this blob. They will identify that you have very important social roles and social relations that are highly localized. And it's a matter of how you participate in that rather than you being defined by that, which is important for Stoicism.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it, you know, you look at somebody like Seneca and it is inspiring in a way to see that you can still aim at virtue. You can still try to be the best person you can be, but you can also still maybe be involved in culture in some way. Like he was a playwright, you know, he wrote tragedies and it's like, that's beautiful. You know, it's, and there's something so incredibly important about embracing one's culture and wanting to add to it and wanting to improve it. Right. And I think that to take the stance as a Stoic that you should just not want anything to do with the crowd is going too far. But I think that there has to be that
very
balance.
Epicurean,
there.
I think it's very Epicurean to be like, I'm going to self-isolate for a different reason. So you're not self-isolating for the common good.
Yeah.
Right. You're self-isolating for your own, what you think is your own good. So it's not the isolation that's the problem. It's the reasons behind the isolation. So I think that's the challenge. Like I've said before on the podcast, we're not called to be left wing or right wing. We are called to be political. We are not called to be, extremely attached to our culture, but neither so distant from it. So I give the example of being British. I have a very colonial mindset potentially. And so I have to really check, my biases, because I'm like, is this part of my British superiority complex that we have in the UK? Like we're this tiny island, which is completely we're a huge island actually. We're the tiny island. It's like, no, we were actually a massive island, not as big as Australia. But you say I have to ask myself, okay, what part of that culture is speaking, virtue, or how is that manifesting, and what part of that culture is rather, quote unquote, vicious? And I know there's I'm blurring a little bit the Stoic sort of definite. I'm either drowning or I'm not, because in practice that's how something I've had to. How do I put this into practice? So I've asked myself on many occasions, am I saying it in this way because I'm a product of my culture, or am I saying it in this? And then the answer is probably yes. And then I try to check myself, right? Check again. It's a very left-wing expression, but checking certain privileges. So it's one of the, I can't deny, I don't want to deny that I'm British. I don't, because I feel very Marxist about denying, I'm not capitalist at all. I'm going to deny that. I'm going to be the shadow of what the object I dislike the most. And I think that's actually a very dark way to go. So I don't want to be anti-British, but I want to acknowledge where some things that are British are quite nice, like apple crumble. I'm not going to not eat apple crumble because that's part of my culture. Or drink a cup of tea. Like, oh no, I can only drink coffee. No, I need to be continental now. I live in Europe. No tea for me. Like, somewhere I can embrace that, because they say as long as it works in, I'm working towards virtue, that culture, it would enrich me. And if I attach to my culture the point that I'm holding, say, a Confederate flag, let's say, then I might say, that's not very pro-social, based if I understand what that flag, assuming I understand what that flag means, right?
What's wrong with the Confederate? No, I'm just kidding. Go on. Sorry.
Well, depending on depending if people hold that flag without even knowing what it means, right? So assuming that I know what it means, I'd say, well, is that being pro-social? Like, is that kind of message part of my wider obligation to the global community, and I would argue quite strongly without going into it, probably not. So it's not about distancing myself so much that I reject my Britishness, but I'm not so attached to my Britishness that being British is my first and foremost, my duty to Britain is first and foremost. I use the example like living in Portugal at the moment. If the UK attacks Portugal, I don't see why I should defend Britain just because I'm British. That's where I say, okay, I am British, but why did they attack Portugal? Oh, because they wanted to land grab. Very British thing to do. Okay, yeah. I don't think there's any virtue in that. So as a British citizen, the Queen can call me and say, well, your duty is to the Queen. I say, my duty is to the global community, and what you're doing is vicious in that particular scenario. But there's a language.
Yeah.
No, Will, does that make sense?
No, that does. And actually, something you said made me want to clarify an earlier point regarding the collective well-being that could manifest from self-isolating. There is a little bit of discussion at the moment about what would the Stoics say is our duty or is our rational reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. And because Marcus Aurelius lived through a pandemic, the suggestion is we've already got a template there for how to respond to it. I think my interpretation of our collective sort of responsibility to COVID would be that we're not trying to avoid death by self-isolating, which would be very unstoic to fearfully run away from death, so to speak. But rather, if we are self-isolating, that can still be an entirely stoic mechanism. As long as we're appreciating that everything we do is interconnected with this whole, and we have a responsibility to take the view always of our interconnection with that whole. And a lot of the rhetoric around self-isolation seems to evoke some of those collective responsibilities and those interconnected responsibilities beyond just the individual, dare I say, atomic self. And so in that regard, a lot of the ways that the Stoics respond to what seemingly seem like fearful situations are not because of wanting to preserve one's physical life, but more about recognizing one's relationships with people you've often never met.
Yeah. That's an interesting point as well, right at the end there, that idea that you're actually taking care of people who you have never met. You're thinking about, you want to have the same sort of feelings that you have to your closest circles, to everybody, because everybody is a part of the logos, right? Yeah. And this is a cool place where I want to take the conversation, because Will, as a sociologist, like, you obviously study the patterns of humanity. You study how people are acting, like, what kind of patterns are going on. And I want to get your opinion on something, because I really think that the Stoics have something extremely valuable to offer to places like America right now, where we just see massive divisions all around the world. People are just, I'm left, I'm right. And going back to what you said, Kai, about, we're not called to be left or right, but we are called to be political because it's important, right? Now, I actually think that Marcus Aurelius hits this on the head, right? And he says that something that he learned from one of his teachers is don't pick sides. And when I look at America right now, I see that from my perspective, one of the roots of the problem is that people pick sides. And they decide that I'm left, or they decide that I'm right? And as soon as you pick a side, it's no longer about who has the best ideas. It becomes a show. And politics now in America is nothing more than a giant show put onto an audience that loves that kind of show, right? Like, you go on YouTube, every video is Trump slams the Democrats, Pelosi slams Trump. It's like, you can't get away from it, but there's a reason why they give us that, right? Because we want it. We're hungry for that. It appeals to something deep inside our reptilian brains, right? That we just want that. We want that fight because we pick sides. What are the patterns that you're seeing in humanity right now? Where do you think we're going with all this, like with all the division?
Well, I think it's continuing the tradition of team-based politics. And I think the Stoics would categorize it quite easily as being contingently social, as being something that isn't necessarily invested in virtue. It's just a symptom, really, of a certain social arrangement.
Symptom.
And And that will perpetuate and will take different names, it will take different forms, but it's not necessarily indicative of universal reason or individual reason for that matter. Which is why I think when we look at ration or reason, your own reason as something that is a trace of something that is beyond you, rather than something that you can kind of allocate to a socially convened team, you get this great sense that no human or alien is a stranger. And this is one of the great practical benefits for people new to Stoicism of viewing it through this really communal kind of lens. Think about, for instance, if you encounter someone who is irrational, they're behaving completely out of what you'll consider to be normal. Perhaps they could be a political opponent in this context. They could be running down the street doing whatever. Now, in one regard, you can be completely indifferent to their behavior. You can treat that as an external and employ Stoic reason and categorize it accordingly. But treating externals indifferently is that's one thing, but another thing is to not treat the person themselves as an external. And new practitioners who could look at Stoicism through this communal kind of priority of the Stoics could get this great sense of, okay, their behavior is external, but the person is not. And there you get Hierocles' sense of reach out to people you don't know. Now, he means that figuratively as well as literally. And I think it counters some of the estrangement, particularly in current politics, where people will refuse to acknowledge the other. There is pure otherness in current political discussion. And I think the Stoic sense of sociality is somewhat of an antidote to that.
Antidote, that's the perfect word. It is. And because when you understand, this is actually why I think that it's so important to look at what you're looking at, like the movements of people and the patterns and everything. When you understand that every single person has what you have, the universal reason, right? Every single person is just an offshoot of you. Like Aristotle said, your friend is you, right? Like if you act in your best interests and they act in their best interests, it's like one soul. And when you see other people like that, then you see yourself in other people, right? And you see that you're not a separate person. You are me. Like I can see that I could be angry like you. I can see that I could be deceitful like you. Like Marcus Aurelius said, you wake up in the morning, you think of all these people, but they're like me and they're for me to work with them and them with me. But we've lost that. We've really lost that today. There seems to be this growing movement of people who will not have a discussion if the person on the other end of that discussion thinks slightly left of what they're saying or slightly right of what they're saying. And
I just want to clarify something you
jump
said,
in.
because it's not that they have reason, they have capacity for reason. And I want to clarify one other thing. From a Stoic position, it's not that humanity from a Stoic position is not negative or aggressive to one another. In fact, Epictetus says that if you've lost a sense of shame and modesty, you've cut yourself off. You're effectively no longer acting as a human being. You're acting either as a sheep, which means randomly, or like a beast, because you're trying to devour others. So they would say if in your human role, you're actually pro-social. So anybody who is not acting pro-socially is either acting as a sheep, as in those that follow and have no idea what they're doing. They're just acting what we would call randomly because such and such a person on the left or such and such a person on the right said something and therefore they have to agree with them because that's the shepherd they're following, or they're the beast, they're literally devouring reason. So the Stoics would say that if you're taking yourself out of that, it's not that humanity is inherently bad or inherently in conflict. And even Darwin would say that our collaboration gives us success as a species, not our individual desire to stake out a claim or what Will calls a turf war, right? It's the idea that we are inherently social. And then when we cut ourselves, and I would say in the US, there is no sense of modesty and there's no sense of shame on both sides in certain people, some worse than others. When you cut yourself off from humanity, that's when you see this ugly spot rear its head, right? You just see everything that comes out. But I wouldn't say that it is humanity. I would say it's the minute you've decided to pursue indifference and they are more important to you, so status becomes more important to you, wealth becomes more important to you, being right, not reasonable, but being right becomes more important to you, you then cut yourself off. And that's when you see the ugliness. They'll say, oh, it's natural for humans to be negative. It's natural, because they're basically saying, I'm just following the natural lead, and it's normal. They're normalizing their behavior. And actually, if we took a Stoic perspective, actually, if you're going to be a moron, that's not natural. Actually, what you're doing is you're negating your humanity. They would stop. I would think that some people would stop doing it because they no longer can justify this poor behavior, because it doesn't make sense from a Stoic perspective that we are naturally unclean or dirty, or this is very sort of Platonic Christian viewpoint of like, oh, original sin. Like, there's no original sin in Stoicism. So we're not originally, it's not where we were with God and therefore we fell from a garden or something and then we became negative and then God had to save us. That's the kind of connotation that you have even in the US, that we're prone to do this. We have no choice, but we can just ask for forgiveness. But Stoics would say, no, you are supposed to be pro-social. You're called to be pro-social. And if you decide to cut yourself off, you're no longer human. You're not playing that role. So I just wanted to distinguish that it's not that there's no dystopia in that sense. Like, we're not condemned to this
I understand
chaos.
what you're saying. I know, and I have been corrected on that now, because I see that that's how the Stoics see it. I guess it's maybe, I think that even that perspective, it is so easy for that to become perverted. So, for example, let's take abortion, for example. We're not going to get into a discussion, but on both sides, you could have that person saying, hey, the other side is not taking care of their social responsibilities, or they're not being a part of the... So, for example, on the right, you could have people saying, well, you're killing babies and therefore you're separating yourself from the society. Yeah. And on the other side, they're saying, well, you're killing women who might have problems with their birth and they can't get an abortion. So you don't care about women and therefore you're away from society, right? And that still leads you to otherizing people because you see them not as human, but you see them, as you may have said, like, and I'm not saying that you're calling people animals, but you see them as separated from yourself. But if the goal is to be a human, and to be a human is to be perfectly aligned with our social nature, then a human doesn't exist, because there's not a human who hasn't at one point in their life, or still doesn't hold some sort of prejudice or some sort of stereotype, or it just doesn't exist, right? Like, I don't know, you can both probably jump in here, but I don't know, are we going to rely on the sage being the only person who's like a true human in that case?
No, I think there are those moments which we've all recognized in Stoicism where they will say that if you act irrationally, you make yourself an abscess on the universe, for instance, is one term. So it's not that the ideological figure of the sage could be the only social constituent. Rather, the point is that and this is a nice intersection with sociology, is that we're all inherently social. We're inescapably social. We're inescapably communal. That's our default mode. Now, for the Stoics, the way that we rationally accord ourselves with the universe will determine whether we maintain that, whether we slip in and out of it, et cetera, et cetera. But for the difference between that and social theory is that normative and non-normative behavior, and by that they mean if you completely step outside social trends, then you're still socially conditioned. You're still socially produced. You're still part of it. It's all a very complicated fabric. The Stoic sense of being social would not only comprise the sage in that sense. It would rather always involve everyone, to the extent that your decision-making process is a collective citizenship. It's something that you've derived from what Marcus Aurelius calls the universal singular community. And you can't help but have that. Sure, you can act irrationally, and at those points, there'll be a tension between you and the universe, so to speak. But that doesn't discount the fact that you are born for community, as he literally says, or as Seneca says, born for universal fellowship.
Yeah. Okay. So could you almost say that? Okay, so everybody is socially conditioned. However, we're kind of on a sliding scale with Hitler and Stalin at the very bottom, because that's a perfect example of a couple of people who are so far out that, you know, there's no possible way you could say that they are, it is inhuman, right? Like to be that. But then on the other end, you have Trump. No, I'm just kidding. No, you have like, you know, you have like what Gandhi, or somebody who, you know, like is an example of somebody who brings people together and is part of a social. It's like, is it a sliding scale then, as opposed to you're either socially conditioned or you're out of what it means to be human?
Look, that'll come down to interpretation for sociology and social theory. But the point for Stoic philosophy will be that you can't escape your inherent conditioning. And your inherent conditioning is that you're part of this universal community. Whether you like it or not, you've got these roles that you have to fulfill. And those roles, like the bees and the ants that they observe doing their daily work, those roles will determine whether you're living the rational life, the virtuous life. And that's a very localized sense of it, but you still have this universal sense of sociality as well. So it's not a sliding scale in that regard. You just are it. You just are oriented toward it. And as we said, and as many of the ancients will say, there are going to be moments where you don't do what you're meant to do. You don't fulfill your communal responsibilities. You don't fulfill your rational nature. I don't think that means, though, that we could quantify it, where someone's... I'm not suggesting you were saying that.
I wouldn't say that we should quantify. In fact, I would just say that we should all recognize that I am you, you are me. We're all part of this social family.
Yeah.
Just rhymed there. Thank you very much, everybody. But you know, like you know, and by doing that, you can break some boundaries, so some barriers that you have between people. You know, because it is very unfortunate to hear conversations, you know, where people literally are just saying, you know, oh, those people are, it's kind of like that basket of deplorables kind of mentality, right? It's like anybody who doesn't think what I think is outside of what it means to be human. And I think that the Stoics really do have a lot to teach us on that front.
Definitely.
But you know, sorry,
you hit
go
it
on.
on the head though when you say that, because basically, I mean, it sounds a bit weird, but I mean, Hitler, you could say, was profoundly social in some sense, because he rallied. He wasn't an individual.
Damn it, Kai.
The reason why
you took
he
it
had,
there.
the reason why they say when you're not neurotypical, like a psychopath, is not. There are certain people that are not part of that bell-shaped curve because they don't see the point of being social. But Hitler was profoundly social because he rallied amazing amounts of people. Yeah. But what he did is he used a device that othered. So what Gandhi does is he recognizes that we're all under the same, we're all human. And what you just said was that Hitler failed to recognize that for his own devices, his own purposes, and he othered. So he put that basket of deplorables. So that's the difference for the Stoics, when you're able to say, I am social, but I'm pro-social. I would say Hitler wasn't particularly pro-social. He used social mechanisms because that was inherent to his human condition, but he used it in a way to be anti-social. So when we're anti-social, or we refuse, which is basically, in your terms, and I agree with them, refusing to acknowledge the other as ourselves, that's when we have the distinction, not whether we're social or not. As I said, there are a few people that are psychopaths who are not social. They will be completely isolated, but that's not part of like the bell-shaped curve. And that's why I say that's not neurotypical. And I'm not, I mean, I don't know Hitler's mind and I don't want to analyze it, but yeah, I would definitely say he's anti-social, but he still used social mechanisms, because if he didn't, he wouldn't have rose to power. His whole power was based on the ability to rally the masses against a minority, or different types of minorities.
And in a way, couldn't you also say that the fact that he did rally so many people around him speaks to our unbelievable connection to that need to be a part of a tribe, to be a part of a community, because he rallied so many people around him. And not only that, he rallied them to do things that are so atrocious, right? That we look back on and we think, how could anybody, like, obviously it's clear that if we were born in that situation, we probably would be one of those people, right? It's like it's just how humanity is. But does that speak to what it means that we are unbelievably connected to this social fabric that we will even go so far as to follow somebody who is completely, evil, right? But we will do that because the social aspect of who we are overrides the virtuous aspect. And that's what Stoicism tries to do. It says, make sure virtue is number one so that you don't fall trap to those kinds of things, right?
Yes, it does. And you provide a great example there, because Hannah Arendt, the 20th century philosopher, has covered what she describes as the banality of the evil of the Nazi era, where you had people working for the Nazis and people following the Nazis who weren't necessarily passionately anti-Semitic, but nevertheless, it was just what was more financially viable to work for them. It was collectively inspiring to be part of a group. And when she covered the war trial after World War II of Eichmann, he came across to her as entirely unremarkable. He indeed had a partner who was Jewish. And so the idea that there was this essential passionate Nazism in these people was discounted. And in fact, these people were just kind of going along with the flow half the time. And so your last point was great, because Stoicism does warn us against this in their mantra against social conventions. And they are saying, you have this reason, you should exercise it constantly. You should not be shaped by all of these contingencies, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, especially in a time like today when you've got so many different, very complicated things happening around the world. There's, and this might actually, let's take it. Okay. I know we're not going to be able to spend all of our last time here on this subject, but, climate change. I wanted to discuss this with you both. I'll probably start with yourself, Kai. I know that this is your area of expertise. To set the scene, I don't necessarily, I have not looked at the literature because there's so much literature. I have not looked at the facts because there is so much out there, right? And I come at it from a completely different perspective. I think that there's a lot of ideology involved in the way that people talk about it, especially uneducated people. And that would be myself. So that I don't want to do that, right? But I know that I can trust experts like yourself, Kai. I come at it from the moral standpoint of saying, if we are connected to this universe in a very important way, if we are, like as Alan Watts said, we're not put into this world, we come from this world, right? Like our body is literally from this world. And so if it's like you wouldn't chuck trash around in your own home, and this earth is our own home. So is it virtuous to litter? Of course not. Is it virtuous to catch all of the fish in the sea and leave nothing left? Absolutely not. Is it virtuous to absolutely pollute this planet? It's not virtuous. It's not a good thing for us to be doing, and that's clear for many reasons. But what do you think that the Stoics say about the way that we should view the environment, Kai? And then I know that that Will, you've got a whole chapter in your book collaborating with Kai there in many ways as well. But Kai, jump in.
I'm going to assume we're going to take climate science as a fact just for now.
No, of course. And I don't want you to get... What I'm saying is I'm staying in my lane, right? I'm staying in my lane, and that's my lane.
So, so this is actually an AA Long argument that he showed me, that just because something is a fact doesn't mean I should do something about it. It depends on, in part, the consequences of the fact. It depends on, in part, in my role, right? So I would say, like, do I have a role? I mean, not me personally, because I have a bigger role because of the nature of my job, but do I have a role to say not throw litter in the street? Yes. Like, do I have a role to perhaps not have as many long haul flights if I know, or someone who knows this stuff and I trust them says, every time you get on a flight from Australia to California, every time you do that, you're going to take off a few meters of ice. And then I go, okay, is that bad? And then you ask the question, is it bad? And you deliberate. So you'd say, how many people are on this planet? Okay, there's 7 billion. Most of them live where? The coast. Right, what happens if the ice melts and most of our population, like 80%, of the population live within a very small part.
For Australia, it's
between the coast.
everybody. We're all gone.
Everybody, yeah. You go, okay, who lives on the coast? Okay, what would happen if the ice melts? They would drown. Isn't that bad? Do I value human life? Like, you start to do that. Okay, what happens if I just moved everyone to the mountains? Where would they grow their crops? I've just drowned all their crops. Then they would starve. Is starving people bad? Like, you have to actually go through, like, reasonably, like, every single, like, basic, I would say very basic argument, because, like, people said to me, yeah, but this world is not as hot as it used to be. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. No scientist is claiming it's the hottest it's ever been, right? The problem is that when it was really hot, we didn't have 7 billion people on the planet. So if we only had, let's imagine we had 1 million, like, people and 1 million, let's say Homo sapiens and 300,000 Neanderthals, right? Okay, we can probably be a bit more flexible, because, you know, we can work out, let's say we had the same technology, we could probably have some greenhouses, and it's only 300,000 Neanderthals you have to look after, and 1 million Homo sapiens, brilliant. And we could do that because we have a very different situation. So I say to people all the time, okay, that's true. It's not the hottest it's ever been. Which 3 billion of people do you want to kill? Which ones do we value the least? And that also gets this, like, very shocked reaction. But it's true. Basically, if you're saying I value more my 4x4 and I value more my flights, I'm basically making a statement that those people were very vulnerable and unable to move, because they're assuming that because they're Australian or because they're British, they would just move. You think people in Bangladesh can just move? And you go, okay, so let's imagine a place where they all move. Like, let's say Mexicans don't really like being hot, and because of the climate change issue, and they move to America. What could possibly go wrong? And then you start to be like, this is a massive problem. If this mass movement, I'm not saying it is climate change, I gave that example, I don't think it is at the moment, but it will be if we continue this trajectory. So you start to ask yourself these questions and say, if I value other people's life, what should I do? If I value justice, is it fair that I get a greater share of resources and they can't even eat? I would say that's a lack of justice. And you say, perhaps it's even lack of self-control. Like, no, I need my 3 steaks. I need it. It's really good for my iron content. And you say, well, what about if you just eat vegetables? You can also get iron from vegetables. And you say, okay, then maybe there's a mechanism of self-control here, because greed is never good. Lack of self-control, and injustice obviously is a vice. So if you can reason with me, if someone who said to me, no, I disagree with you, Kai, climate change is good for the planet, I'm from Greenland, it's going to be brilliant, and actually Greenland is probably going to be better off, then I'd say, okay, do we only live in Greenland? No. Okay, so you'd have to reason with me as to why the other 7.9 billion people can, the rest of them can die, and the small population of Greenland can be better off. Which sounds very utilitarian, and in the sense that it is, because you're actually saying, okay, what am I valuing here? So climate change is a fact, and then how you cash that in virtue depends on all these circumstances. So it's that context, depends on who you are, what you know, and you have a duty to gain knowledge. Gain information, and then convert that information into knowledge, which then becomes wisdom when it's literally embedded in you, and you actually walk it out. So then you say, okay, if I have an obligation to inform myself either by reading or by asking Will, then whatever, based on, I know that they do the reading for me, which is fine, can't read everything, then basically I need to make a decision based on the facts they presented and the reasons behind the facts themselves. This is why Becca and I really like Becca's work, in the sense that he made a really huge effort and did some really interesting things. The facts themselves don't tell you what to do. So if I live according to facts, okay, climate change means climate is warming, and there's no reason just based on a fact that I should do something. Because you can't derive, it's David Hume argument, you can't derive values from facts. In Stoicism, you don't have to, because you have the logos as the objective yardstick. I mean, it's more than that, but you can use it as an objective yardstick. So I don't have this fact value distinction that I do if I use Becker's approach. I don't know, Will, if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, jump in, Will.
Wow, there's a lot in this question. I also am a fan of Becker's work. I like the attempt to reorient, let's say, these terms into a really contemporary context. Social theory in particular has been very interested in the idea of whether value and fact can be commensurate. I discuss in one of my chapters a social theorist called Max Weber, who says science can tell us what we can do, but not what we should do. Now, this is a contentious argument, but nevertheless, it's relevant here. I think in terms of my own inquiries into the climate question with Stoicism, firstly, yeah, Kai's work is quite inspirational in that regard, as is William Stevens. But in the particular chapter that I wrote on the environmental question, I did find myself really inspired by one of Kai's co-written pieces, actually, with Leonidas Konstantakis. And from that, you find these symmetries, I suppose, globally, of people who are interested in the application of Stoicism to environmentalism and questions of sustainability, without it just being how can we save the planet kind of discussions, but rather, what does it mean to be impelled to save the planet? Why do we want to save the planet? Why should we save the planet? Why should we save ourselves? So in the chapter that I wrote on this, I looked at the fact that primarily the Stoics were interested in this principle of change underpinning the universe. So Marcus Aurelius, for instance, says it would be rational to be upset by the fact that the physical world changes. So from that, then I ask, if the Stoics are so emphatic about change and they say we should accept change, does that mean that a changing climate would also be harmless? Should we just accept that? Now, of course, within Stoicism, you need to consider the causes behind things. And in climate changes, in the example of climate change, we'd have to consider whether causes which underpin climate change are rational. So I would suggest that to determine whether the causes of climate change are rational, we need to ask whether they cohere with the whole order of things, as many of the Stoics would say. And let's just say, for argument's sake, I'm not pushing any particular line down anyone's throat, but let's just say you believed that the decisions and processes involved in industrialization were involved in the causes of climate change. So my perspective would be that if you were to determine whether they were rational from a Stoic perspective, you wouldn't just look at the effects or the climatic effects. You wouldn't just look at pollution. You wouldn't just look at sea levels, et cetera, et cetera. Rather, your responsibility from a Stoic regard, firstly, would be to ask whether those decisions and those actions appreciated their interconnection with everything else in the universe. And that might sound abstract and vague in one regard, but in another regard, it doesn't, because it takes the localized industrial setting out of that exclusive geography and asks, what are the ramifications of those actions, those decisions for surrounding environments and so on? So I think the question of climate change and Stoicism is going to be contentious because people already come to it with their particular investments. And in that regard, and they'll also question the statistics around climate change, whether the sea levels are actually rising, whether the pollution is actually as bad. And so one way I think we can skirt around those aspects of the climate question, which are not necessarily agreed upon, is from a Stoic perspective instead to ask, do these decisions and actions appreciate global or universal interconnection? Now, if they don't, then they're irrational. And then climate change would not be a physical change that we would consider to be rational and part of the whole order of things.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm grasping what you're saying, but can something that exists within the cosmos be outside of what we think of as rational, right? Because it's like the logos or, the cosmos is a well-ordered whole. And I guess going back to what I probably didn't portray in the best light, but what I'm trying to say about what I think of the situation is, so we start with the idea that the Stoics taught that we are not separate from nature, we are not separate from this world in any way, we are a part of the whole. Like, so we have the cosmos, and we're in the cosmos, you can't take us out of it, therefore we are part of it. and God is this, like, going back to, you know, pantheism, is like God is flowing through everything. It's flowing through me. It's flowing through you. So we can even look at it as friendship. I don't treat you in a poor way because you are me, because we're both made from the same thing and we're both part of the same cosmos. In the same way, I don't throw litter on the street because that street is me. Like, the environment that I live in, the environment that I am from and go back to, is not separate from me. It is me. And that not only does things to my mind, this idea that I would allow myself to throw litter on the street, but it has those effects that ripple throughout culture, right? Somebody sees me do that, they might do that. And it's like, in the same way that you wouldn't trash your body day after day after day with crappy food and just become an absolute monster, like you wouldn't do that with the world because it is you. Do you know what I mean?
I do. That's a very monistic way of looking at it. A very monistic way of looking at it. And I like that reading of Stoicism. As I said at the outset, that's what it appealed to me, was its physical simplicity, if you like.
Yeah, Kai, I think you wanted to jump in as well.
I got to jump in with there is an extent where we don't go as far as deep ecology. So the idea that I can become a tree, I just want to clarify, if anybody, I'm not saying you're saying that, but there's people go, oh, so therefore you Stoics think that we can become trees because no, it's that we are anthropocentric because the only perspective we can take is the one human one, but we're equally logocentric. So we are not biocentric. We don't think that we can become trees or squirrels we're inherently human, but we share the logos. So our role is different. So though we can see the essence of the logos in the tree and therefore the essence of the logos in us, we can't become a tree or see the tree from a tree's perspective. But I just had to clarify because otherwise people are going to be like, I also think this is a Chris Gill argument, actually. Christopher Gill said that nature has providential care, and if our actions diminish the providential care that nature can provide, we actually have to step up. So I thought that was really interesting, that if by doing these irrational actions, so basically like the irrational action becomes, as Will just said, am I affecting nature's ability to provide providential care to myself, others, and the wider Earth's community? Yes. Therefore, any actions that I do on purpose that would render this providential care, in a way that is more limited or even absent, would be bad. Like, it would be actually vicious. And I have a duty as a human being to recognize that it's logocentric, that we have this shared logos, and that I have this higher level of rationality in the sense that I can collaborate with my own species better than other species can collaborate with their species. So I'm not saying that no animals are rational. I'm just saying our rationality enables us to collaborate in a way that no other species can, which has caused this climate change effect because of the cumulative effect. And therefore we have to use the same understanding, that being pro-social, the same essence of fragment that's in us, to then come to the solution. We need to use the same mechanism. So I think if we...
Well, it works on so many levels, right? Like this understanding of our place in the cosmos, really, that's why I think it is so central to Stoicism and this idea of alignment with nature, or living in agreement with nature. If you understand it in the way that we're kind of talking about here, I really think that it is so central to everything in Stoicism. It has to be at the forefront, this understanding that you are absolutely connected to absolutely every decision you make, every person you meet, every person you don't meet. You are connected in some way, and so every action, it's like you don't want to have that decision fatigue where you just get so bogged down in, oh, should I do this, should I not do this, but you should be conscious of the fact that you leave ripples throughout the world, just in the same way as if you dropped a pebble in the water, that ripple would go on for forever. It's like, just recognize that, and then maybe you don't need to get so bogged down in a lot of the literature on these very important but very I guess deeper subjects that could take a long time because you can rationalize it. And you can say, well, I don't need to contribute to global warming because it's clearly not good that I would do this to the planet, like in a different way. But Man, this has been absolutely awesome, guys. This has just been so much fun. I want to do it again. Obviously, we'll have you on as a solo one time as well, and but it's so much fun having these group discussions as well. And Will, I want to thank you so much for coming on and being so giving of your time as well. Kai, thank you for obviously inviting Will on the show as well. I will always take your recommendations because you're a freaking pro when it comes to bringing new people onto the show. But Will and Kai, I'll give you guys the last words if there's anything you want to leave with the audience, and tell them where they can find your book as well, Will.
So the book is through Palgrave Macmillan, and they have a website for the book now. So if you just search Will Johncock,
I'll chuck it in the links.
Thank you very much. It's coming out in the next week or two. And thank you very much for the chat. It's been very interesting.
So there you have it, my interview with Kai Whiting and Will Johncock. So guys, I'm sure you enjoyed that as much as I did. I'm going to put all of the links to where you can find Kai and Will's work in the show notes there. So go check that out and let them know how much you appreciate them coming on the show. You'll also find the link to where you can buy Will's new book, Stoic Philosophy and Social Theory. Really excited to get my hands on that book when it comes out, and I'm looking forward to reading that. So without any further ado, I'll talk to you guys next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date with the Practical Stoic community and everything to do with this podcast, then just go to my website, simonjedrew.com, and subscribe to the Practical Stoic Weekly, a newsletter that I send out every week with updates and all sorts of great Stoic insights. You can also find me everywhere online by searching Simon J. E. Drew. See you next time.